He's the great David Katz, everyone. Across the English-speaking world, they get David Katz on British radio and television. He's been on Fox News Channel countless times, and across the television landscape in this country as well. And by the way, New Zealand and Australia. Katz, you're everywhere. I love it. And you know, we've talked a lot about the convention and politics, David, and I would like to double back with a legal question for you about that and about the election and about legal challenges in a moment. But first, I'd like to kind of divert from that for a second, because there was a hugely high-profile case that was then followed by this tragic accident involving this super yacht. This is a really odd thing, David Katz, but there is a TikTok. This is never, I promise, in all of your appearances, what I'm about to do right now has never been done. There was a TikTok influencer, I guess you'd call her. If you have it ready, Albert, I sent it to you, that I want you to see and hear, because she summarizes a bit of what I would summarize. Maybe she does it better than I would. And then she leaves us with this question as to what happened with this super yacht. But this story is both about the law and about what happened with the law and a lawsuit and a prosecution. And it's about this bizarre circumstance that toppled this super yacht. So here's the TikToker to set us up.
There is no single news outlet that is covering the Sicily super yacht sinking, and justice to how eerie and coincidental and weird this all is. There were three prominent figures on the super yacht, and yes, they are all connected. The first is Mike Lynch, who is a fraudulent tech tycoon. Next is Chris Morvia, who is a lawyer that was just defending this tech tycoon against a big fraud case. Third is Jonathan Bloomer, who is a big Morgan Stanley banker and also was the chairman of the audit committee when the tech tycoon was committing his fraud. In 2011, Hewlett Packard bought Mike Lynch's company Autonomy for $11.7 billion. The very next year, Hewlett Packard had to take an $8.8 billion write-down on their balance sheet, which is basically their way of saying that this company is actually worth $8.8 billion less than the $11.7 billion we paid for it. And how did this happen? Because Mike Lynch inflated the revenues of his company right before the sale. This case was deemed to be one of the largest Silicon Valley frauds in history. Just a couple months ago, Mike Lynch actually won the case and got away with fraud. And here's his lawyer posting about it on LinkedIn a couple months ago before his death. This corporate fraud, robbing Hewlett Packard of $8.8 billion, took place 13 years ago. You're telling me that a few months after the fraud wins the case, the fraudulent guy, the guy that oversaw the fraud on the audit committee, and the guy that defended them all mysteriously die in a boat in Sicily? And even more suspicious is the fact that Mike Lynch's co-defendant, the lawyer that was not on the boat that was helping him on this case, also mysteriously passed away in a car accident over the same weekend. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but something does not look right. Also, Hollywood needs to make a movie out of this because this is literally insane.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot there, David Katz, and you might take issue with some of the ways that she's characterized things, but I wonder if you could speak to both the court case, the HP, they would say, ripoff, and then the subsequent events.
Well, one thing right off the bat is that he was acquitted, and so was his co-defendant at a San Francisco federal trial back in June. Certainly it's not fair to say that he was a fraudster or he was convicted of fraud, because he was actually acquitted of fraud. Now, of course, it's a very high standard in a criminal case. All 12 jurors have to decide beyond a reasonable doubt before they find somebody guilty. But in this instance, all 12 jurors did not find beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, all 12 were unanimous as to the two of them. I don't believe in conspiracy theories generally. Generally, I believe it's very hard to get 2 or 3 people to close their mouth and hide something really big. And when you get into dozens of people supposedly shut their mouth and conspired and then kept quiet about something really big, I just think it's so unlikely. I always think back on the plot of Goodfellas, where after the heist, they tell them, everybody keep your mouth closed and don't buy anything extravagant. And of course, a couple of the heisters, the robbers do end up buying a lot of stuff. So I generally don't believe in conspiracy theories, but it is an unbelievable coincidence that the same weekend that the co-defendant, the main defendant, Lynch, his attorney, and this banker all perish on this yacht, that same weekend in Cambridge, the co-defendant from that federal criminal trial in San Francisco is hit and killed by a car in Cambridge in the United Kingdom. It's definitely movie quality. Anyway, the case itself and the whole situation is interesting, Mark. There's this super yacht. It's apparently moored fairly near the coast. It seems like they could have just gotten off the ship and slept somewhere else that night. These people have this defendant had hundreds of millions of dollars to spend. Remember, he had sold his company for $11 billion plus about 10 or 12 years ago to HP. HP then decides that the books were cooked, that it's not worth the $11 billion, that the claims about it are false, that the press releases about it are false, and they write down over $8 billion. Interesting era at HP. This is the Meg Whitman era. You remember she was a politician who almost became, I think it was governor of California. This is her era of running HP. The defense is that they didn't do their due diligence. They didn't understand the company. There wasn't fraud. If they didn't do their homework, it's not this, they call him the British Bill Gates. It's not his fault if they bought his company for 11 billion and they came to think that it was worth less. They didn't commit fraud. Interesting thing about the case is that they persuaded the FBI this was a righteous criminal case. And the FBI spent a lot of resources on this. Remember, this is not Hewlett-Packard suing civilly. This Autonomy, I think they were called. It was the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco, my old office down here, but it's, parallel office up in the San Francisco Bay Area, that northern district of California. 3 of their prosecutors, along with the FBI, was pursuing this as a criminal case against 3 defendants. They did convict one of them. He went to prison for 5 years. These were the other 2. These were the higher ups. As we all saw in the Wall Street cases, Mark, very difficult to convict the higher ups. Obama got a lot of criticism after the Great Recession. How come all these Wall Street bankers and financier and hedge fund guys, how come they didn't go to prison? How come they sought fines against their company or huge restitution against their company? And this case would show again that it is very difficult to convict criminally, right? These financial machinations. I've read the indictment in this case since it happened, and it is complicated to even understand what happened. The average juror, doesn't understand really high level of business and what's involved in these kind of situations. Anyway, just to come back to the point, they eventually extradite this guy. The British authorities cooperate. The judge.
They extradite him for the court case you're talking about, for the federal case.
Right.
They've extradited him from the UK, right?
Right, and he is a British citizen, a so-called British Bill Gates, but he communicated with Silicon Valley. So there's a lot of emails and phone calls into the Northern District of California. That was the basis for the jurisdiction. That was the basis for the venue up there. And so eventually they try to extradite him from the United Kingdom, and the judge there makes a finding that he committed fraud. Now, that's not criminal beyond a reasonable doubt, but they persuaded the FBI to pursue this case. They persuaded to put their neck out on this case, to stick their neck out on this case. And also they persuaded this magistrate judge, because they have like a mini trial before they extradite somebody from the United Kingdom to the United States. So he found probable cause, or even a higher standard than that, to send this fellow back to the United States. They made various motions to dismiss the case. It went on for several years. This case is from the Trump era. This is a Trump administration U.S. attorney who brought this case. And I don't know the whole, if Hewlett-Packard had influence with the Trump administration. Obviously, if you like all the conspiracy theories, it's worth bearing in mind that this is not from this modern era, the last Biden administration. It's from the Trump administration, but it takes a while to go through the extradition proceedings to get this fellow back here. Then there's the pandemic. So he only started his trial seriously with his pretrial motions and all of that last year. And then in June was the not guilty verdict against him and against his co-defendant. But the interesting thing about the case, of course, is not the underlying trial, but that they're having this victory bash. So he and his co-defendant are acquitted of all charges. He was on house arrest. He's released from American house arrest. He's free to go wherever he wants to go in the world. He's acquitted. He goes on this beautiful yacht of his. He's supposed to have gotten about $1 billion of the $11 billion that the company sold for. So he certainly has the money to maintain this yacht and its captain and its crew, and you would think some better security provisions than what happened. But anyway, they're moored near the coast of Sicily on this super yacht. He's invited for the victory bash his attorney. Now, I've won cases in federal court, but I never got this kind of super yacht trip to celebrate my 4 victories in federal court and my 2 hung juries. Mind you, I had a client with almost enough money, but he wasn't into yachts. He was more into Lake Tahoe, that kind of thing. But he's taken, on this victory lap, he's taken his lawyer. Now, his lawyer is a well-known New York lawyer that I guess had built a big reputation. I don't think he'd won very many cases, and I'm not trying to be snarky, but he held a press conference or went on a podcast like this after the not guilty verdict and said, my God, it was so unbelievable to be in a federal courtroom and to actually win a federal criminal trial. It's so rare. It's as rare as a unicorn. And I just have to show off that I've won 4 separate federal acquittals. And yes, it's wonderful, but I don't think I was quite as ecstatic as this guy was about it. Anyway, his ecstasy continued through going to, with his wife, no less, on this celebration, this victory bash. And my God, how horrible. And this big banker from JP Morgan, I guess he was along for this bash too. So the people who perished were Lynch, he's the British Bill Gates who was acquitted, his daughter who was along, but not his wife. He and his daughter perished. The attorney, a prominent attorney, former assistant U.S. attorney like me, although I don't know him personally, he and his wife perished, and the banker and a couple of other people. I don't know if you remember the thing that we talked about quite a bit when they went out to not Santa Barbara, but near Santa Barbara. What is it? The Channel Islands. Remember that boat that was out near the Channel Islands?
Sure.
And a lot of people on board died. This is another one where somehow the captain and the crew all survived.
Yeah, that was a fire you were talking about off the Channel Islands.
This one too. The captain and the crew seem to have all survived. I don't know if these people, the guests, got pinned down there. There's a lady there talking about the heroine of this story. This is an enormous story in the United Kingdom. Front page of the newspaper, Daily Mail, everything, nonstop, everybody involved in it being interviewed. And there's a heroine of the story. She's a woman who saved her 1-year-old. And it turned out that she and her 1-year-old baby were sleeping on the deck, and they were able to be rescued. Apparently, the problem with these big guests is these big guests had big quarters downstairs, and I guess it took just that much time to get out. And now there's all the criticism of why didn't they take more precautions? They were hit by a sudden thunderstorm called a water spout. And they say it came out of nowhere. They didn't have any warning. And you wonder, there's the yacht right there. With all the security features that they have, Mark, you kind of wonder how this could happen. But it happened. There's no doubt about it. And for the people who think it's a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory, what would be the motive? How do you do it? As the old mobster joke goes, how do you fake a water spout? This thing happened. This thunderstorm happened. If they had been electrocuted on board or something like that. But again, who would have the motive? You know what I mean? The murder mystery part of it, it really doesn't look like it was any kind of a murder. It's unbelievable coincidence that the co-defendant from the criminal trial died the same weekend in Cambridge in the United Kingdom, being hit and killed by a car. So there'll be an awful lot more reporting on this. But again, it's a legal thing. I'm a legal commentator on your show. I guess the interesting legal aspect is just that they did have this acquittal. They were complicated charges. It's always hard to, convict Mr. Big or Mr. Second Big because they insulate themselves, right? But I think we have to assume that the jury did the right thing and that he was found not guilty because he was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, I think you're right. As I try to put these facts together, and the legal stuff I leave to you. The other stuff, like, was this a conspiracy to knock off these billionaires who'd ripped off the company? I, like everybody else, can kind of weigh in on it, and only because it's so obvious in the sense that, you can't gin up a water spout somehow. It just happened. And so had it not happened concurrently almost with what you also described, that accident in which the partner, also acquitted, is hit and then killed by that car, I don't think the conspiracy theorists would quite have as much to work with. It's just that eerie coincidence that I think gives that a little more momentum. But I love the last thing you said, which is who would have the motive? Because as you look at this, I suppose HP would have the motive. I mean, it's the feds would have the motive because they felt like, I mean, in other words, I don't understand who would want these people dead because they felt betrayed. And just to put a fine point on that, there isn't really any one or any group of people in this scenario or narrative that would fit that bill, right? That would want these people dead. True.
Well, you look at the Madoff case, okay? In Bernie Madoff, a lot of people lost a lot of money. They had a good receiver in that case, and so they got back a fair amount on the dollar. But if you get back 50 cents on the dollar and you've lost $2 or $3 million, you've lost $1.5 million to Bernie Madoff. No one seems to have tried to take the law into their own hands. You look at the other cases, Milken, Boesky, cases where people lost a lot of money, huge corporate fights. They don't settle things this way. I mean, there's an awful lot of lawyers and compliance officers and normal people who don't kill somebody, even if the company's lost $8 billion. You take a write-off, you deal with it on your taxes. It certainly didn't help Meg Whitman's reputation. In the trial, they dragged her through the mud. The criminal defense attorneys. I don't think Meg Whitman has any, motive after all these years. I suppose if you're playing murder mystery, you look at this as Poirot, like Agatha Christie. There tend to be multiple murders on these shows. So here you've got a whole bunch of people who were killed, not murdered. There's no evidence that anybody was murdered.
Right, but if you're a murder mystery freak, then you see everything as a murder mystery. Yeah. I absolutely agree.
Right. You're following along with me on that, Mark, right?
It's pointing. Brian Jennings points out Robert Maxwell died on his yacht too. Yeah, but Robert Maxwell died. He was lost at sea, in quotes. That's a far more believable murder and offing of someone than the kind of scenario that we see where there's a superstorm that that capsizes it.
Well, so, Mark, it also makes sense that these top guests had the luxury quarters, and the luxury quarters are probably a little harder to get out of, and they're all older. So you figure the crew and the captain, are all in great shape. They've practiced this. I guess if you want to be snarky, you say it'd be nice if they practice more saving their passengers too.
Yeah, right.
Because it just seems like another remarkable one, like the one in wasn't it the one in the Channel?
Yeah, the Channel Islands. You're right. Where there's a fire and the captain abandoned. Right.
They seem to all make it. Now I'm not sure that maybe one or two of them. I know in this one a cook died. And they've had to identify the bodies. It's been difficult. The people who like these kind of underwater mysteries. This is apparently a particularly difficult one. It's about 150, 160 feet down. The ship capsized immediately and went down. It's at 90 degrees, apparently very difficult for the divers to get access to. It took a while to even get the bodies to the surface. But now they've confirmed that Lynch died, his daughter did, the lawyer and his wife, and the banker, and at least two other people.
I want to move on from this, although I love that everybody's got an opinion and that it has sort of a life of its own on social media, et cetera. But I want to mention a piece of breaking news to you that you might be able to get in on there. We have it up there. CNN is reporting that the Supreme Court is now blocking some of Arizona's proof of citizenship requirements for the November election. This is a way in which I'd suggest voter suppression is beginning to be played out, particularly in some of these red states, Georgia, Arizona. And I wonder if you can speak to this just generally, David. This is obviously breaking news of the moment, but this is a big move on the part of the court to say that these proof of citizenship requirements for the November election may just be a bridge too far.
Well, I think it's a good sign that the U.S. Supreme Court is looking at this in what I would consider a sensible way, just jurisprudentially. When they pass these things so close to the election, and this is pretty close to the election, and it gets reviewed this close to the election, I think to maintain the status quo ante is to preserve what the law was before there was this change. To race around, if you're the appellate courts or the U.S. Supreme Court, and have to decide this, the old thing, Arizona's delay in passing this isn't the U.S. Supreme Court's emergency in deciding all of the details of it. And so I think this is the smart jurisprudential thing to say, you know what, they waited this long to pass this law. We don't have to review it and get to the bottom of it and put it into effect. Let's in fact stay the enforcement of it. Let's delay the enforcement of it. And let's have the election take place, just 6-7 weeks from now, with the old rules, not these hastily, rapidly, close to the election passed rules. So that would mean I thought about it, getting to the merits of it again. I mean, generally, voting requirements, voting prerequisites are up to the state, but to the extent that this has, I'm not exactly sure what the proof of citizenship is, but I can imagine that it's something where the federal government might say, this is really more of a federal area. This is an area where the federal government has preempted this in the immigration field. This may be another instance where these states are basically trying to pass their own immigration laws in the guise of a registration for the election law. And immigration is, after all, a federal responsibility. If you have very, very strong thoughts about immigration, vote in the election, right? You vote in the federal election because it is the federal government, especially the federal Congress, that controls immigration in all 50 states.
So it was a 5-4 vote, predictably. Partial victory to Republicans is being noted to try to enforce something here. In this case, it's proof of citizenship when voting in Arizona. They were asked to allow enforcement of sections of Arizona's law requiring documented proof of citizenship to cast a ballot in the presidential election, including when voting by mail. And a federal judge had blocked enforcement of the law, which prompted this appeal to the high court. That's how we got here. Just trying to read parts of the...
Mark,
yeah.
It sounds like they just affirmed what a trial judge did. The U.S. Supreme Court said, the trial judge blocked it. We're not going to unblock it. This sort of fire drill time frame, 6 or 7 weeks before the election. We're going to let the judges, the judge heard this case, I guess, got to the bottom of it as best he or she could. And the U.S. Supreme Court, I think, again, wisely, is not intervening in it. They're letting that injunction or order of the trial judge in Arizona stand.
I'm now going to just ask you, because we are on to the election, an election-related question. There seems to be more and more speculation around the notion, essentially, that there is a plan that doesn't really include the vote when it comes to the upcoming presidential election. The idea being that the GOP, and this is reflected in some remarks made by Trump and others, has already planned for the fact that they may not win the vote in the way that we normally think of the vote being won, even in our perverted system with the Electoral College, et cetera. But they are planning for the kinds of challenges that will muddy the water legally to the point that the cases related to the election will have to be bumped to the Supreme Court, again, all muddying the water. And then ultimately it may end up in the House, which would be, again, a constitutional sort of linkage to what would be one state, one vote. That's the way it would go down in the House. It's unprecedented. That's not the way it's ever been in American history, but that is the provision in the Constitution. Can you speak to the legal challenges that may emerge and are being prepared for? I should mention this. I talk about the GOP preparing for it. Kamala Harris and her people and the Democrats, they have hundreds of lawyers on this as well, preparing for what they consider a coming assault on the outcome of the election.
Well, I did that in 1992. I was on one of those lawyer task forces for Bill Clinton to make sure that the count got done correctly and that there wasn't intimidation at the polls, that sort of thing. And I think anyone who has a question about my partisan, I try to answer these questions that predict the future as best I can, try to give you the most objective view I can on the law. I do have my blue tie on, a la Clinton, a la Buttigieg. So I think people know my own partisan feelings. But what they seem to have done the election has to go along with these ministerial acts. One of the things that I think protects American elections is that it's state by state. And so when you look at some of the great coups, some of the people who've really engaged in election interference, they've managed to have a federal system, and then somehow they've rigged the federal system. I think down in Brazil, when this guy tried to steal the election down in Brazil, it was by trying to rig a federal election. Here, you have to go state by state, and it makes it awfully difficult to rig it. But that doesn't mean that I don't think Trump and his allies are trying to sort of pre-rig it. And I think one of the things is that time is very important. You vote on Tuesday, then by Friday they have the ballots that come in from like the military and the absentee ballots. So Tuesday's the vote, Friday they come in. Then all of these states have this ministerial act of saying, okay, well, here are the votes that came in. This is what we think the count is, and they certify that count. If you don't like the count, you run to court. And there's a judge who, has experience, has been chosen as a judge, who, we have a lot of trouble with some of the judges, some of the justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, but generally judges are the jewel of our country. They're people who are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to decide cases without fear or favor. And so it's not a stacked, politicized election commission. They just do their ministerial act. But the problem now is that in Georgia, you have this 3-2 electoral commission. These are the three people that Trump praised by name during one of his speech. He's called them the pit bulls for transparency. And it seems like they're the pit bulls to not certify the vote. They have a law down there now that these commissioners, instead of merely performing the ministerial act that we've always thought is what they do, and then if you don't like the certification, you go to the courts and complain to a judge in a black robe about it with an orderly procedure. Now these commissioners in Georgia are supposed to conduct a reasonable inquiry, but they haven't defined what a reasonable inquiry is. So everyone thinks that what the Trumpsters are about to do and this election commission are going to do is if they like the result, they'll certify it. And if they don't like it, they'll have a reasonable inquiry until fare thee well. And meanwhile, the vote won't get certified. And how is Georgia going to cast its votes, especially if the votes are for Harris? How are they going to do that if the election commission sees that they're not going Trump's way, and so they delay it. And in one of these little counties, they can hold up the certification of the vote in the entire state and knock a Harris state offline. And so they keep reporting, let's say that Trump is ahead because the election commission sees that Georgia is going Harris's way. With that may go the election, instead of pointing out, you remember Bush v. Gore, instead of pointing out, hey, Harris wins. Harris carries Georgia and wins. Instead of that, Georgia is held back. It's held back. They keep flashing on the screen, right, that Georgia's uncounted. Trump's ahead, Trump's ahead, Trump's ahead. And if that's the way it actually ends up being, instead of what's fair, which is that they would certify it promptly and let people go fight it out in court, they would do shenanigans like that. That's what people are rightly worried about. And I think they're going to try to battle that out in the Georgia courts. One thing you can say about Georgia is that while they're Republican, these are the Republicans, some of them, like Raffensperger and the governor down there, I think his name is Kemp, who stood up to Trump. They've endorsed Trump this time because they're Republicans, but they did stand up to him last time when he had a lot more power. He was the incumbent president when he tried to push them around and called up on the recorded call and said, all I need is 11,500 votes. Find me the votes down there. That was at a point mark when the vote had already been counted, recounted, hand counted, electronically counted, and Trump had lost. And that's when he called up and said, find me those votes, meant concoct those votes.
I think it's worth noting and underscoring what you just said about small counties and smaller districts that involve election officials that are not high profile. So you end up with people you don't know. You think, well, these guys, Raffensperger and the others who we've come to know now for pushing back on the effort to overturn the election or concoct additional votes, they'll likely be strong again. It's not always about them. As you said, it's about those. I love the narrative that you just drew out. It's about people that we don't know and may never know again. Their very futures may depend on how they, and it's become so hotly contested, and people fear physical violence and all the rest. The notion of public service now has become fraught with all these other things. I did get this, which was interesting, from our Herrera. You Dems, man, you can shell it out, but when it comes to Congress your way, OMG, us, how dare you? I'm taking that and I'm going to try to, again, understand it. It's the way in which you would predetermined on, honestly, R. Herrera, that you were going to try to throw it to Congress. It's not. It's like gaming the system. And to me, it's suppressing the people's voice. That's the reason I think it's worth noting.
Well, the other thing is that if you get it to the House somehow or another, you make it so complicated, or you say these votes didn't count, you have alternate slates, everyone throws their hands up in the air. I think constitutionally it goes to the House, where they don't vote. Even if the Democrats controlled the House, they would lose, because I think, at least it used to be, that you voted by delegation. So again, North Dakota has the same vote in that process as California does. And I think there are 26 or 27 red states. And there are incredibly populous states like New York, Illinois, and California that are only 3 states. They're only 3 of the 50 states, and they only have, whatever it is, 3 votes. So it ends up being, I think, 26-24. And so a Republican wins if you can somehow get it all the way to the House. And I think that's what some of those experts did back in 2020. That was what they were telling, Trump and Pence. Just find fault with everything, and when it goes to the House, we win because we have 26 delegations, and the Dems only have 24. Ha ha.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, there are many who don't know this still. I mean, you're right. It was visited a lot during the 2020 results. But again, it goes 1 state, 1 vote. And as David has just said, the red states outnumber the blue states. So if you're a Trumper, that's the other way you make it to the White House. And it's clearly being talked about again. Obviously, it was talked about in 2020, and now it's being talked about as a legitimate strategy to perhaps craft a different outcome than the vote would suggest. David,
Mark,
I love having you visit. Sorry, go ahead. You have something else?
Do we have time to talk about the non-compete for 2 minutes?
Oh, yeah, please. I meant to bring that up. Go ahead.
Interesting situation. So the Federal Trade Commission, a federal agency, decided that these non-compete agreements, and they cover 20% of the workers in America. Many of your listeners, I'm sure, either are covered by or have family who are covered by these non-competes. And it's not just, if you're like, inventing a cure for cancer and you go to the competing cancer curing firm. It regards 20% of the electorate. All kinds of jobs in America are covered by these non-compete agreements. And when you leave, you can't work in that field for a year, or maybe you can't work in a certain kind of aspect of it. And so the Federal Trade Commission under President Biden decided that these were a restraint on trade. They lessen competition, and that they should no longer be enforced. And that if a person was covered by a non-compete agreement, they should get a letter that said, by the way, I'm your former employer, and the non-compete that you signed with me is null and void, and you have the right to compete. A judge in Pennsylvania, picked by the Democrats, picked by Biden, ruled that there was nothing wrong with that at all. And the Federal Trade Commission has power over competition, and decided that these were anti-competitive and shouldn't be enforced. Well, don't you know it? The Chamber of Commerce ran to a judge in Texas, and they found a federal judge in Texas to rule just the other way, and to issue an injunction which said that, no, this is beyond the power. This is the administrative cases that are so important that you and I talk about, Mark, and said this was beyond the statute. This was not something that was within the Federal Trade Commission's purview or bailiwick. It exceeded their powers and enjoined. So now you are not going to get a letter that you would have gotten within a week from your former employer telling you, don't worry about the non-compete. You have every right in the world to compete, to pursue your trade, to pursue your business, your whatever it is. And it looks like that will not be overturned. It'll probably end up going through the appellate courts. It may go to the U.S. Supreme Court. It'll be really interesting to figure out what they're going to do with that one. For your listeners in California, you may worry about, am I covered by one of those? For about 100 years, California and a couple of other states have decided that these are against competition. And so they're very restricted in California. They do work in some fields. Don't take my advice over the podcast. Talk to an attorney if it really matters, because the problem is if you do compete in a way that the non-compete says you're not supposed to compete, you may get sued by your former employer. And if you lose, end up paying attorney's fees. And so they're draconian. They scare people into not doing their profession. They exist in law too. There's law firms that say you can't go out and try to solicit the same client, or do something like that. They're very prevalent in many fields. And I agree with the Federal Trade Commission. I think they're anti-competitive. I agree with California and the states that bar them or limit them under state law. They would have been thrown out under federal law, but now a judge in Texas has issued an injunction. And so, at least for the moment, the FTC rule is not going into effect, Mark.
This is exactly what we've talked about week after week, the undermining of regulatory agencies like the FTC, and that's what happened. And I've worked under non-competes pretty much my entire career, even in California. Usually the way it's recrafted in California, David's so clever to point to the fact that California has tried to allow for you to be able to go across the street and work because there's sort of a right to work aspect to California law. But there's a cooling off period is what I've always worked with in media. So they'll say, you can work for us here at NBC, but if you want to go work across the street at ABC, you have to give us a 6-month cooling off. And that is, the idea is during that cooling off, you kind of lose your media imprint. People forget who Mark Thompson is in that time. So I've always worked with those kinds of stipulations in those deals, but very much the merger and acquisition part of America has made it harder and harder to find competitive work. And as one company, particularly, again, my experiences in media, owns everything, you can't go across the street because you're across the street by virtue of being with this company. So it just gets harder and harder. And these non-compete clauses, I just think, favor business and favor big corporate structures so overwhelmingly. It's a shame to see that go down. But again, that's the nature of the beast right now. You think it will clearly be appealed, and we'll have to see how it all works out.
Yeah, I think it will be appealed. This is one where, without having analyzed all the briefs and the issues, this is one where I have a little hope for this U.S. Supreme Court. If to the extent they have any kind of a libertarian streak, I know they have a big business streak. We predicted that with the pharmaceutical cases, that they wouldn't be a theological court. They would be a very pro-business court, and the huge pharma, they'd be behind huge pharma. I'm not quite sure what they do on this one, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, at the end of the day, they just said whatever the big corporations want. And you're right, the big corporations profit from this, especially because they have the resources to sue the little guy who goes out and competes. So you go out and compete, you don't think the cooling off period's fair. You want to strike while the iron's hot. Mark Thompson's hot. You want to go out and not cool off. And, you get threatened with a lawsuit and you say, you know what, ABC can afford a lot more to bring this case than I can afford to defend it. I'll just cool off for the 6 months, and then you don't get an opportunity that should have come your way.
Yeah. Love our time. Thank you, David. I haven't asked you. And I don't want a commitment from you because I think it's a little unfair for me to ambush you in this moment. But if you want, consider joining us for our meetup for 15 or 20 minutes next Thursday night. Pat Thurston, your old girlfriend, Pat Thurston, will be there.
If Pat's on it, I'm on it.
That's what I thought.
I couldn't find my sunglasses today, Mark, so I had to drive around with my World Series hat of 2016. The Cubs they were then called the Cleveland Indians, now the Cleveland Guardians. Cleveland is in first at the moment. The Cubs are not. It may be another 100 years before they repeat. But I had my hat on today, so I might wear my hat on your show. But I'm doing everything I can to juggle my schedule so I can so I can be there. Pat Thurston's there. I'm there.
Yeah, Pat's going to join us, and it'll be a lot of people who you
Kim,
love.
You have to be there.
Yeah,
Kim, Pat,
Kim
and I
will be there.
Okay, Kim. If you and Pat are there, I'm there.
Yeah.
I'm there.
It's the Zoom meetup. I'll send you a link and you'll join us 2 glorious hours a week from tonight. If you're going to be part of it already, you can look forward to seeing the great David Katz as well. Thanks, David. Appreciate you and look forward to seeing you next week.
My pleasure. See you then.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.